I'd now like to invite Dr. Clarissa Brown-Douglas from Kentucky Equine Research. She is our first speaker for the evening. She is a nutritionist for Kentucky Equine Research and originally hails from Wellington in New Zealand. She has an honours degree in animal science and also a doctorate in equine growth and development. She's spent a considerable period of time in Kentucky working with thoroughbreds and also analysing a lot of the information around thoroughbred growth and development. We'd like to thank her very much for her time today in doing this presentation and look forward to what she has to share with us this evening. So welcome, Dr. Clarissa Brown-Douglas.
Thanks, Kath, and thanks very much for having me today. That was a really lovely introduction. Great to see so many faces in the audience. That's wonderful for a Sunday afternoon, so thanks very much for coming out tonight. For those of you who don't know about Kentucky Equine Research, I'm going to give you a really, really quick Cliff's Notes version of what we do. We're essentially a research, product development and consultation company. I think a lot of people think that we just do products, but it's a really small part of what we do. Most of our work is looking at various questions that are posed to us from performance horse, racing, breeding industries, and then we go off and do some research to try and work out how to make sound horses better, unsound horses sound, etc., etc. We do this research on 3 facilities, 2 in Florida, 1 in central Kentucky. We have mainly thoroughbred horses there because they're easy to get hold of, but also that's traditionally who we've been doing our research with. But a lot of research now comes into other breeds with, for example, quarter horses with muscle myopathies, etc., and other breeds for performance such as standard breeds. So we work in conjunction with other universities who might have herds of horses and also on farm, so with a lot of private breeders who allow us to have access to a lot of data that are collected from their horses. So it's not just thoroughbred work that we do. At the facilities in Florida and Kentucky, we have an amazing sports physiology laboratory set up with a high-speed treadmill, an exercise physiology lab where we're able to analyse samples as the horses worked, including oxygen uptake, carbon dioxide output, and also we can run a venipuncture there and take blood samples while the horse is working to look at what fuels the horse to run or perform really well. One of the things that concerned me when I started working at KER was the fact that equine and research was in the same title, because I know animal research gets a bit of a bad rap, but these horses are lived in a very, very wonderful environment. We adhere to really strict ethics protocol, and we always invite people, if they're visiting Kentucky or Florida, to come and visit the facilities and see how wonderful these horses are looked after. Essentially, they get to eat lots of different types of feed and let us know whether they can perform on it. A lot of our work is digestibility and metabolism studies, so we need to measure everything that goes in and everything that comes out, and so these horses, some of them wear these equine nappies which allow us to do fecal and urine collection. They seem to be pretty comfortable on them. They go on the exercise walker in them and can lay down and sit up surprisingly in these contraptions. With the results of these studies, we do a lot of publications in scientific journals. We present at a lot of university conferences, etc. But we really want to share that information with horse people, and we do that through the feed industry. We consult with over 45 companies globally who have knowledge of their local environment, from pasture production that the horses have access to, but also local grains and ingredients. So instead of making a feed in Australia and sending it to the United States, for example, we get them made over there because they know their environment the best. And so essentially our logo's on the back of a few different feed bags because we help formulate their feed. And so in the Southern Hemisphere, we work with Barrastock, obviously, Milne Feeds or Pegasus in WA, NRM and Macmillan Feeds in New Zealand. My role that Kath gave you a quick introduction is I'm a nutritionist. I have a PhD in animal science, and my PhD focused on growth and development of young thoroughbreds raised at pasture. I've been with Kentucky Equine Research since 2005. Goodness gracious, there's going to be a party next year. I work with our New Zealand and Australian feed partners, but I also do a lot of on-farm consulting, looking at growth of young horses and feeding the breeding across the breeding industry, and that's my personal interest is in breeding and growth. The seminar outline today, I'm just going to go through a few of the latest trends that we're seeing across the breeding industry, because over the last few years, certainly with lack of face-to-face conversation with breeders, with COVID, etc., there's been a few trends that have developed that I'll touch on that we've been seeing as we've been going on farm. I'll do a little bit about broodmare nutrition, foal and weaning nutrition, and then a bit of yearling prep tips and tricks that we've learned over the years. So some of the hot buttons that we are seeing in the breeding industry at the moment is simplicity. A lot of farms in the past have mixed various feed ingredients together as a secret recipe and then fed that out. With reduced staff that we're seeing across the industry and less experienced staff, studs are asking us for more simplicity so that less mistakes are made across the board. So farms are wanting easy to feed out, all-in-one feeds. They're wanting feeds that incorporate a lot of supplements, so supplements that might be linked to bone or joint health. The other thing that we're seeing is that we've had this crazy season of a lot of wet, a lot of rain in the last 12 months, and certainly during spring and summer it was very wet, and so a lot of hay wasn't cut, and a lot of fibre production was pretty average, to say the least. I know that trying to source hay at the moment is tricky because we're getting to the end of availability, and certainly the quality of hay is also not that great unless you've got a secret stash. So a lot of farms are asking us to either source feed, high fibre feed, and formulate feed with added fibre to it so that we can keep the quality of fibre into these horses. And so things like hay cubes and beet pulp and other chaff sources are certainly getting snapped up. The other thing is that people are doing it tough, not just in with our going to the supermarket and seeing these crazy prices and interest rates, but everyone's doing it a bit tough, and so we're looking for a lot more value and cost value in our feed. So considering feeding pellets versus mueslis, etc., which can tend to be a little bit shaved off that bottom line, buying in bulk, filling up silos versus bagged, and also sourcing grain and balancing grain out, raw cereal grains, for example. I know there's not a huge amount of x-rays that go on in your industry, but certainly there's increasing use of x-rays and deciding how we're going to manage the young stock once they've been x-rayed. And I think that certainly what we've learnt with the thoroughbred industry is we need to question what's normal and understand that nutrition is only one factor linked to x-ray results. Various ways to handle those versus surgery versus time, confinement, etc. And a lot of the work that Kentucky Equine Research has done is looking at the size of our horses when they're born, so foal weight and growth rates over that first 12 months of life, and then the incidence of bone and joint disease, and then further on looking at success on the racetrack and what we can look at, what we can turn a blind eye to or not worry too much about in the joint situation, and then how they succeed later on. We highly encourage breeders to weigh their young stock using scales or weight tapes. Monitoring their growth can certainly help prevent growth issues and further down the line prevent joint problems. Just one of the results we found and know well that weanlings and yearlings that have lower bone density have more x-ray issues. And we're also looking at the positive effects of some feed ingredients and additives on bone development and cartilage development. We're also seeing a lot of farms needing custom mixes or requesting custom mixes, because we all know that everyone grows different pasture. There's different irrigation and non-irrigation native pastures, different reseeding happening, and so a lot of farms will get those tested and look for a custom mix that balances out those pastures, and also personal preference. The other interesting thing we're seeing with labour shortages is that people are prepping horses for sale with fewer staff, and so there's potentially less ability to exercise the horses, which can help calm them down, but also less experience, less ability to handle these relatively hot horses when you bring them in and feed them a lot of grain. So we're seeing people wanting calmer prep feeds that have less non-structural carbs, which are starches and sugars, and more fats and fibres to potentially create a calmer horse. Also, we're seeing a lot of growth data being used at sales. So farms are increasingly, or purchasers of young stock are seeing the benefit of seeing that horse's growth curve over their first 12 months, seeing that there wasn't any drop-off in weight after weaning or massive growth rates that can cause joint problems. So that's something to consider if you are selling at sale. We know that the industry, regardless of whether it's a standardbred industry or a thoroughbred industry, demands large, well-grown horses at sale, and that's why we prep our horses for sale. But we also know that when we grow them, we've got to grow them steadily for sound growth in their skeleton. So we highly recommend monitoring horses, but it's not routinely performed on farms. KER developed a software program, when I first started there 20 years ago, called GrowTrack, which allows breeders to weigh their horses, input their weights and heights into a computer program and assess that against a population. We have populations in our program of all different breeds. We have standardbred curves from rapid growth, slow growth, etc. We've got all performance horse breeds and of course thoroughbreds from various countries. The new GrowTrack's great because it works on a Mac now, which it didn't do. It's got an app. It's available free to breeders to use, so anyone is welcome to use it. There's better reporting. You can compare your horse to a percentile, which is similar to paediatric growth, where you're able to compare how they're growing against the population. A lot of people go, oh, I couldn't possibly weigh. That's just another job on a farm that doesn't have a huge amount of staff. And certainly most growth of horses is subjective and mostly done by eye. And this certainly doesn't take away from an experienced eye looking at a horse. Regular weighing just adds another objective measure. And it can be done when, for example, the mare's in the crush, when they're in for trimming, if they've got some time in the boxes. And it just adds a great value to your livestock, I believe. The GrowTrack has got some really quite detailed outputs. When you enter the weight in, you can compare it to a reference curve and see whether they've got a steady growth curve or not. So we highly recommend downloading that software and using that on your farm. One of the things that doesn't go onto the software program because it is subjective is achieving a desirable body condition score. And this is typically how we assess them at the sales. We give them a score based on body fat cover from 0 to 5, essentially feeling along the crest of the neck, the shoulder, the rib cage, along the back and down on the rump. We don't look at the belly per se because fat is not carried on the belly. And that allows us to give a score out of 5. Essentially, we want to see our breeding stock between a 2.5 to a 3.5 and our young stock at about a 2.5 to a 3. Often our mares can be a bit heavier, sometimes our stallions can be a bit heavier too, so we really need to avoid getting them too fat. We're all at a point where we've got foals about to arrive or possibly just arrived, so early pregnancy is hopefully gone, unless you're breeding to Northern Hemisphere time, which we don't want to be doing, I don't think. And but early pregnancy, when we're got the mare in foal and we're feeding them, we don't want to suddenly go, right, they're pregnant, we'll double their feed. And we also don't want to forget about them as well, so they need a balanced diet, but their requirements are the same as maintenance. So as long as they're getting adequate vitamin, mineral nutrition, good forage as the basis of their diet, they're good to go for at least the first 5 months. But if you look at this graph here, you can see how the developing foal changes in utero in terms of body size. At 7 months of gestation, it's about 20% of the 20% of the birth weight and less than 2% of the mare's weight. So there's not a huge requirement in that first 7 months for calories, but in those last 4 to 5 months is really critical for the growth of that developing foal. One particular area that it's really important for is for cartilage development. Foals during this time will absorb 4 main trace minerals, zinc, iron, manganese and copper from the mare for use once it's on the ground for cartilage development. And you can't play catch up, so you can't suddenly go, oh, I didn't feed the mare properly, let's give it some copper when the foal's on the ground. They've done some really fantastic work actually out of New Zealand looking at cartilage development in foals, and you've got to get these ingredients into the mare nutritionally, not through injection, in those last 4 to 5 months to help with cartilage development once the baby's on the ground. So for late pregnancy, really vital to increase trace mineral intake of these mares. There's a slight increase in energy requirements, but it does depend on the mare, so assess body condition depending on how she looks. You can either feed a balancer, like a forage balancer with good quality roughage, and add some oats if you've got those available, or other grains, or you can feed a fortified breeding feed at the recommended intake. Once your baby's on the ground, the mare's energy requirements do increase significantly. The energy requirement for a lactating mare is about the same as a horse in full work, so it's an awful lot of energy that she needs to produce good quality milk. There's also increases in protein requirement and calcium and phosphorus, which are of course your two main minerals that are in milk. And the mare will often, they say, provide milk off her back, so make sure that she gets enough energy into her diet, so don't underfeed them. There's some good links between nutrition and fertility, and certainly body condition and weight is a big factor. A lot of farms will have fatter mares, and a lot of owners prefer fatter mares. There's certainly some talk about really fat mares having trouble foaling, dystocia, but interestingly the science doesn't necessarily support that, but we certainly don't recommend having very fat, overweight mares, mainly for other reasons such as insulin resistance, laminitis, etc. But there's also a situation where you don't want the mare to be losing weight, or skinny mares, because you have trouble obviously getting them back into foal. You have longer inter-ovulatory periods, etc. So it's tricky with skinny mares too. Interestingly, in production animals such as sheep, there's a benefit from flushing them, where you put them on an increased plane of nutrition, which helps them with their ovulation and breeding. However, there's been no research to support that in horses, so that's also interesting too. But yeah, balanced diet for brood mares is pretty vital. Once you've got babies on the ground, their nutrition's pretty important too. Obviously, if you've got a well-lactating mare, that's great, but you've just got to remember that during that first 12 months, there's a really big increase in skeletal development particularly. Lots of minerals are being deposited into the bone. When the baby's born, it's got only 17% of its mature bone mineral content, so there's a lot of mineral that has to go into that bone in the first at least 12 months of life. And nutrition mistakes can cause big problems later on. One question that we do get asked is to when to introduce feed to the young stock, and it does depend on how well the mare's milking, but certainly the milk will be the primary source of the foal's nutrition, although you'll see babies nibbling on pasture and nibbling on their mum's feed, very early on in their life, and that's absolutely fine, provided the mare's able to get access to her feed. But you can see the divergence in those curves on that graph. The energy provided by the mare's milk does drop off after sort of 2 to 3 months of lactation. Foal energy requirement obviously increases, and this is about 60 to 90 days when we say that the foal should potentially be given its own meal, or at least have access to more feed. This can be done by creep feeding or feeding with the mare, and it's also quite difficult to estimate mare's milk production, so it's obviously a good idea to keep looking at seeing how they're going, and if you do think that the foal's not gaining condition early on, you do need to potentially look at providing more calories early on. Once the foal is weaned, it's a really critical point of development, particularly of the skeleton. A lot of farms will wean and they'll turn out and they'll go, great, off you go and have a good old few months, and we'll bring you back in for sale prep. But this is a time when the skeleton is most vulnerable to disease. So it's really important during this time to make sure that they don't have a big weaning drop off in body weight, or they go to a really good paddock and they end up gaining huge amounts of weight and have those very good fat coverage over the rump and back, for example. So it's really important during this time, we say, to monitor growth rate. And then feed different diet scenarios depending on what you want to do. If you want to prep them for early sale, if you want to prep them for yearling sale, you're going to be managing them slightly differently nutritionally. But don't wean and forget, they still need vital nutrition every day for sound bone growth. Bone is such a big factor, and it's obviously when you haven't got good bone and good joints, that's one of the major causes of wastage once these horses are a bit older, and so you do need to feed them properly for that. At 6 months of age, they're about 70% of adult bone mineral content, and at 12 months, about 80% of adult bone mineral content. And certainly we do need to provide them with the substrates to grow good bone during that time. And this is a really fantastic diagram from Deb Bennett, who's a well-known scientist, looking at when bones mature in terms of growth plate closure and mature bone mineral content. And you can see essentially it works up from the ground up. So when we look at things like scapula, femur, pelvis, spine, skull, those bones don't actually mature until we're talking about 4 to 6 years. So we are working, when we're working with our young stock and breaking them in and entering training, we are working with really immature young horses, so it's a good idea to keep that into consideration. With weaning, there's a few different feeding scenarios, and it does depend on how one manages them. If you want slow and steady growth because you're breeding to race with no sales prep, you can have them out on good pasture with a balancer pellet, which is a low intake, sometimes 500 grams to 1 kilo per day, that just gives them good quality protein, vitamins and minerals, and that'll be plenty to keep those young things going. If you've got poor pasture, then you do need to provide supplementary forage with quality hay and potentially a breeding feed, which has got more calories per mouthful, so you need to feed a bit more of that per day than those balancers. Prepping for sales, quality forage is vital, and then looking at a breeding feed or a balancer plus cereal grain, added fibres such as beet pulp and oils, etc. Once the horse reaches 12 months of age, they're less likely to develop clinically significant developmental orthopaedic disease, so joint problems such as OCD and fasciitis, which is an inflammation of the growth plates. If you do see a clinically significant lesion after this age, it's usually developed in the 6 to 12 months window. It just hasn't become clinically evident until later on, or if you've gone looking for it with X-rays. Again, as yearlings, correct nutrient balance is important, and we still recommend monitoring growth rates during this time. During this time, horses are going through puberty. There's usually a spring pasture flush. They've got a pubertal growth spurt. There's behavioural situations, particularly with young colts, that might do crazy pronking in the paddock and can have some trauma to their joints, etc. So it's really important to manage nutrition to support that. When we're feeding yearlings, potentially we might want to be, we would want to be separating out our colts and our fillies. Colts with more energy to burn will need more calories usually. Fillies can tend to get a little bit porky on really good nutrition. Good spring grass, be careful not to overfeed. Often again with these guys, a balancer pellet is all that you require. With sales prep, we do want to increase caloric intake, but it's not just a matter of bringing them in for 4 to 6 weeks and pumping them full of cereal grain, because you'll end up with huge problems there. You do need to consider a few different areas, which I'll go on to shortly, but quality forage is still important. You can add calories from lucerne, which is a high calorie forage, breeding feeds, oils, high fibre ingredients such as speedy beet. So before yearling prep starts, a few really important things to happen. Obviously handling vital, looking at conformation and doing some preliminary hoof trims, etc. to help straighten legs up. Avoiding growth setbacks, so that means making sure nutrition is adequate all the way through that period. Deciding on how you're going to prep them with what feed. Tail chewing is a really big one. You can't grow a good tail in 4 to 6 weeks of prep, so you need to make sure that's sorted well before your prep starts. And obviously separating out your colts and your fillies. Some of the challenges that we see with sales prep is ensuring that the horse is eating, and the diet change from bringing them into a stall environment for even part of the day from the paddock. So this is where you need to be looking at really tasty feeds and encouraging them to eat. There's issues with behaviour when they're in a positive energy balance, so bringing them in for prep and suddenly feeding them, you can end up with behavioural issues. Matching feed to the work, building muscle and fat cover is a big one. Getting them fit for parades and also peaking at the right time is a pretty major prep challenge. A lot of the problems that we see during yearling prep are things like too fat, too cresty or too thin, no neck, no top line or muscle, and I'll go into these in a bit more detail further on in the talk. gut issues through diet changes, so looking at gastric ulcers, hindgut acidosis, colic, etc. Looking at joint problems, so fasciitis is a big one, which is an inflammation of the growth plate. You generally see that down at the fetlock with weanlings and at the knee with yearlings. And that's essentially an inflammation while that growth plate is growing long bone. It goes away, but it often doesn't go away in time for the sales. So it's important to manage that during prep as well. Bad coats, hay bellies, behavioural issues, and not wanting to eat are other issues that we're dealing with. So during the first week of prep, obviously that's important to adjust them to the stable, making sure that they are slowly adjusted to a diet change. So don't introduce feed rapidly. Do that over the period of that first week, particularly if you're going to be feeding a high cereal grain diet. The gut microbes are not going to be happy with you if you suddenly feed them kilos of grain in a couple of days. So high hay intake. Still have turnout on pasture and introduce the feed slowly because you want to avoid colic and hindgut acidosis issues. You also want to avoid weight loss, so bringing them into the stables, they make stress, so you need to consider really palatable feeds as well. Regardless of what stage the horse is in, whether it is a mature broodmare breeding, a stallion or young stock, forage is of course the most important part of the diet. And so forage is pasture, hay, fibre sources such as beet pulp, soybean hulls, chaff, etc. It's really important that horses receive 1.5% at least of their body weight in roughage per day. Often that's provided by grazing good quality pasture, but often we don't have good quality pasture available, so they do need to have hay available to them. Don't necessarily recommend chaff, or chaff is fine, but it's a very expensive form of forage. But chaff during prep is great because it slows feeding down, it fills feed bins, and it's certainly, if you're feeding chaff, it's a lower energy form of feed that you can add supplements to, so it's very helpful there. We always recommend ad lib hay when they're in the boxes. I notice that a lot of fillies do get hay bellies towards the end of sales prep, and a lot of farms won't want to feed ad lib hay, but it's important if they are heavy to find a low calorie, high fibre hay for them so that they've still got feed going into their bellies, because an empty stable, when the horse has got in a stable without hay, they can end up with gastric ulcers, they can chew wood, it's just not great. So sourcing low sugar hay is great for those particular horses. And certainly there's so many feeds on the market, so many fantastic feeds on the market that you can prep horses to. But remember that you get what you pay for. So good quality feed that contains good quality ingredients does cost money. However, you do benefit from in the long run. It often comes down to personal preference, whether you want to feed a pellet or a muesli style feed. Do you want to concentrate? Do you have good quality oats available to you that you just need to feed a balancer with them? There's lots of different scenarios that we help build diets around for our clients. It's important not to use a full feed at a low intake and cut that with cereal grain, because feed is formulated to be taken at a particular intake, because not just the calories we don't just take calories into requirement, we take in all vitamins and minerals. So if a feed says you've got to feed 4 kilos per day for a 500 kilo horse, if you feed 2 kilos per day, you're only getting half of the nutrition into them. Lots of different energy sources are available. Obviously I talked about your fibres, but then cereal grains, then there's pre-mixed feeds and fats. So you can pretty much make a diet out of lots of different things, but a lot of people do feed grain, and that's great. One of the best grains, I think, for energy is oats. There's no need to process them. You can feed them whole. They digest really well, and generally you can find a good supply of them. Other grains such as corn and barley do need to have some sort of processing done. A lot of people shy away from processed grains because they compare it with human nutrition and go, well, we can't possibly feed processed feeds to our horses, but horses do have to have their grains processed in some way because they are not great starch digesters. They don't produce much amylase, which is the enzyme that's designed to digest starch, and so we need to help them out a bit with these grains by either heating them or cracking them, or at least exposing that starch to digestion. so that they are absorbed and digested in that small intestine, because if we end up with starch that's undigested entering the hindgut, which is the big fermentation chamber at the end of the horse's gut, you can end up with hindgut acidosis issues where the bacteria essentially act like children eating jelly snakes and go nuts fermenting that starch. You can end up with a very acidic environment there, and the horse can get a very upset tummy. So that's why we aim for processed starch. So make sure that if you are getting corn or barley in your diets, that they have had some level of processing. There's also been a big increased use in super fibres. These are highly digestible fibre with a lot of soluble fibre available. And the main ones on the market are beet pulp, so speedy beet, and soy hulls. They are digested by fermentation in the hindgut, just like a hay fibre source, but about 70% of the fibre is fermented for energy. So on a weight by weight basis, they've got similar calories to grain. They are really good for cool, calm energy, and one of the best tricks I find for reducing hay bellies in sales prep horses is feeding a high amount of beet pulp. And that can tuck up tummies really nicely, because often a hay belly is just full of indigestible fibre. So if you substitute out hay or less digestible fibre for a highly digestible fibre such as beet pulp, you'll end up with a really nice tucked up tummy, but also a healthy tummy. So that's always a good trick for yearling prep. Other ingredients that you'll see in prep feeds and ingredients that we recommend feeding to these horses is fats and oils. Horses digest oils really well. They're very energy dense, so a small mouthful contains a lot of calories for building condition. It's a calm energy, which is also helpful for behaviour. It's certainly digested well. It's really great for improving coat, and certainly also for performance horses and race horses that might tie up. Adding oil to their diet is a great way of getting calories into them. Horses that tie up need to avoid non-structural carbohydrates, so you want to reduce the reliance on starch, so reduce the intake of grains and add fibre and oil as energy for those horses. Lots and lots of different forms of oil available, from vegetable oils such as canola or flax oil or rice bran oil, also stabilised rice bran, and then marine oils, which provide long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, which are, again, a talk in their own, and how they might influence inflammation in the body. Protein's a big one. A lot of breeders shy away from protein because there was a misconstrued information about protein and its link with joint disease. We know very well that protein's really important for sound growth, and it certainly has got no link to the onset of developmental orthopaedic diseases, so we do need to feed quality protein to our young stock. Ideally with decent amounts of amino acids, lysine, methionine and threonine. I think you can rest assured that if you do feed a good quality breeding feed, the protein is balanced and high quality. Also lucerne hay is a really good form of protein, and soybean meal, etc. Salt and electrolytes are also pretty important. We recommend having a salt block pretty much available to every horse in a field if possible, and then top dressing salt onto feed if you've got that, if you're feeding them a bucket feed. Certainly for performance horses that are sweating, they do require that. And at the sales, it's a good idea to make sure that they're getting electrolytes, because there will be increased sweating happening there. Yearling prep exercise programs vary and probably depend on facilities and labour, but it is important to have some level of exercise, because obviously you're going to build muscle, you're going to improve bone density, improve appetite, calm them down and get them fit. Lots of different ways to do it. Certainly start off short and monitor lameness and inflammation, so make sure that if they are sore or they've got some fasciitis in the knee, for example, you want to make sure that gets backed off. Hand walking is pretty important, but if you're lucky enough to have a walker, that's fantastic. Lunging, playing in the yard, etc. But yeah, considering speed and time and labour is important. Just to summarise up, there's a few little areas that we've identified that are issues when we're prepping yearlings. Cresty and too fat is a big one, particularly with smaller fillies. So monitoring weight gain is pretty important, looking at how much average daily gain they're getting, and that's by basically the difference between two weights over time. Make sure that they're getting a lot of work if they're sound. Grass hay, low sugar, low calorie grass hay, and looking at just maybe feeding a concentrate or a vitamin mineral balancer. Sometimes it's difficult not to say, right, well, they're prepping, so we need to give them big buckets of feed, but often these fatties just need to have the basic nutrition to grow, and they'll be fine on their fibre-only diet. Those that are at the opposite end of the scale, when they've got no neck, no top line, you're going to have to feed more calories, so divide that up into as many feeds a day as you can manage. Obviously, you don't want to be feeding huge feeds. No more than 2.5 kilos per meal is really important for gut health. Working them in a roller and watching hay placement. I've seen a lot of farms who are prepping have got hay nets up really high because it's easy to hang them up high. And these horses that have got no top line, when they're feeding up high like that, they build a lot of muscle under their neck, and it sacrifices the top line. So if you feed hay on the ground, ideally you can get a more stretch in the top line, and you can help with removing that big under neck. Also looking at feeding substrates for top line, such as Equijal, which is a stabilised rice bran. Lucerne is high quality fibre with lots of calories, and also super fibres. When they won't eat, that's also a problem. So palatable feeds is really important. Muesli over pellet sometimes help, but obviously focus on gut health, because often a horse with a sore tummy is not going to want to eat. So look at gastric ulcers, get them scoped, treat them with omeprazole. Hind gut health, mental health. Are they not liking it and they stressed, and have they got a buddy, for example? Turning them out for more grazing, smaller feeds so it doesn't overwhelm their stomach too much. And looking at concentrate calorie sources so they don't have to eat so much to get things out of the feed. We want to avoid gut issues, so introducing our feed slowly is really important. Adding chaff to slow down intake. Lower starch feeds, and obviously processing grains, which I mentioned before. Lots of different supplements available to prevent gastric ulcers, and that's something that you should consider with prep horses during prep. The other thing is that never work a horse on an empty stomach, so feeding a handful of lucerne hay or chaff before they're worked, regardless of whether they're a baby getting worked during prep or a mature horse, you don't want acid splash when they're working. So providing that fibre raft in their stomach will prevent acid splashing up into that really sensitive region of the stomach. Also considering omega-6 fats, which is different to what we talk about with omega-3s, corn oil, rice bran, etc., which can help with prostaglandin production and help with ulcer healing. Also looking at potentially feeding a coating agent as well. We know that a happy horse usually has a happy gut, and so again, when we're feeding these high grain diets to these young stock during prep, they can potentially have starch escaping digestion in the small intestine, hitting the hind gut and causing a very acidic environment. So we often recommend a hind gut buffer during this time. Often I'll walk through stables of yearlings who are getting prepped, and they'll have really, really runny manure, and it's really smelly because they're on a very high grain diet. They'll look like cow pats in there, and that's just indicative of a gut that's not super happy. So we do recommend looking at buffering that gut, because they still need to be fed those calories, and so helping to provide an environment which makes the horse a bit happier with less acidity in the hind gut is a good idea. Behavioural issues are tricky because, again, you want to make sure they're getting enough calories to grow. Wrapping it up, okay, very good. So reducing grain, more turnout, more exercise. Too short, too tall, essentially you can't change that because it's genetic, but you can optimise that with good nutrition in utero and on the ground. But essentially, this particular graph shows percentile at birth versus percentile at weanling and yearling on good nutrition, and those that are down at 0, which is really small, stayed really small. You don't want to be feeding them up because you'll end up with issues in the joints, such as this, which is fasciitis. I have to wrap this up, so I'm going to zoom through this really quickly. This is where you need to cut back energy. You don't want them growing so rapidly, and you want to make sure that inflammation doesn't cause issues with lameness. Better bone at sales. Again, no short-term fixes. I'm happy to talk to anyone after this if they want some specific information. Hay belly, beet pulp, coat issues, oil, and methionine, zinc, and biotin, helpful. in the last week, taper work, cut back grain, avoid that hay belly, attention to detail, and at the sales, similar thing. Make sure that they want to eat, provide them with anything to make them eat, whether it's molasses on apple sauce on the top, etc. Make sure they've got a hay net. But yeah, it's hard work, but you will get rewarded for a job well done. Remember that you've got to start early, so in utero, those babies are going to be absorbing really important nutrition for bone and cartilage development. But nutrition, again, won't fix all problems, so it's not always linked to some of the issues you see. Individual feed programs are pretty important, and we highly recommend monitoring growth rates, so come and see me afterwards if you want some information about getting GrowTrack for your farm. Lots of nutrition resources available. We are available to do nutrition consults. That's a complimentary service that we do. We're happy to come on farm, help with weighing, help with monitoring young stock, and also we have a great newsletter available if you're interested in finding about what we're up to in the research world. So, sorry about that rush at the end.
So, Clarissa, thank you on behalf of HBV and everyone here. Just a little token of our appreciation.
Oh, wow, thank you. That's lovely.
So, a fantastic speech.